with the Project Management Coaching Podcast with certified trainer and project management expert, Dan Ryan.
Hey, everybody, PM Exam Coach Dan, and I'm so excited to be back with another episode of the PM Project Management Coaching Podcast. All right, now today is a special episode because today I'm joined by Jeff Dalton, who's an Agile enthusiast and an Agile evangelist. Welcome, Jeff.
Thank you for having me, Dan. Great to hear you.
Yeah, man, it's good to have you on the show. So a couple of big pieces of information about Jeff. First of all, Jeff has a killer website on Agile called agilecxo.org. Right now, of course, all the links will be in the podcast, but at agilecxo.org, Jeff is helping companies with models, training, and certification for sustainable agility at their organizations. All right, so check out agilecxo.org. Also, Jeff is known as the CMMI Appraiser, and he's got a blog, a cool blog called Ask the CMMI Appraiser.blogspot.com. All right, where he goes on his platform and talks about all the best ways to provide guidance for Agile, Scrum, and all of those lean methodologies. But maybe most excitingly of all is Jeff has this killer event scheduled for September 27th called the Big Agile Retrospective in Washington, D.C. on Thursday, September 27th, 2018 from 11 a.m. to 2 p.m. It's going to be an amazing event where Jeff is going to be a keynote speaker. He's going to be joined by other members of his team. Tell us what you're going to be providing to people at that event, Jeff.
Great. Yeah, the Big Agile Retrospective is an opportunity for technical leaders who are either successful or struggling with large-scale agility to come and share with us their stories and help crowdsource the models that are going to improve the state of Big Agile and making it work at scale. And best information comes from the people that are doing it. So they're going to have an opportunity to share that, tell us what's working, what isn't, and help contribute to the state of the industry. It's a free event, so everybody's going to get a lot of good stuff out of it, and the models are going to get better and better. So we're really excited about it.
That's awesome. So you'll actually present, you'll give them great info, and then you'll take feedback from them to update your own assets.
That's right. It's a circular continuous improvement, and our models are crowdsourced Agile. And everything in our models comes from people that are actually doing it. So it's not theory. And this is going to really help improve that.
That's fantastic, Jeff. Thank you for that. So definitely, guys, the links to the Agile event, as well as his blog and his great website on how to build great Agile at your company, they'll all be in the podcast links. Please check them out and go and visit Jeff on those various locations. All right, Jeff, let's talk a little bit.
All right.
So let me start really high level. First of all, I've got a lot of listeners that are really interested in learning about Agile. Now, I am Agile certified, but really I'm that PMP Waterfall guy. That's really my shtick. But I just wanted to speak to an expert. I've met with many people that you know. They say you're the expert. And so, but I want to start off general. Let me ask you, how did you first hear about and how did you first get involved with Agile methodology?
Well, you know, I have a background in software engineering, and I've done a lot of programming in my life over the years, and eventually moved up in an organization, became a director and a VP of product development, and the teams were really hungry for it. And, you know, back in the 90s, Agile wasn't a big thing. There's a little bit of Scrum going on, a little bit of XP, but teams were really hungry for more autonomy, more self-organization, you know, more of a say in the way that things get done in their environment. And that's really what Agile is about. I mean, Agile is about self-organization and, you know, teams experimenting and learning and sort of an empirical approach to software development. And, well, really at this point, any kind of product development, but back then it was just software. And it was really my teams that, you know, brought it to the table and said, we're really interested in making this, you know, more self-organizing and autonomous. And so, and I'm all for that. And so we did our research and we started doing lots of things that are now called Agile. But back then, of course, Agile wasn't a big thing. So we had our own words. But yeah, I've been doing it since the 90s, and it's a really big part of my life now, not just my business life, but my personal life. So I'm a big fan and believer in the philosophy behind it.
That's awesome. So if you didn't call it Agile in the beginning, what did you call it?
Well, back in those days, we called it iterative development, rapid application development,
Oh,
rapid
rad.
prototyping, RAD. You know, it's funny. I really have a deep respect for the folks that put the Agile Manifesto together and have made you showed it popular. But you know, back in the day, we just called it a really well-run project. Uh,
Yeah,
right?
nimble.
I mean, even if you're, you know, you introduce yourself as a waterfall guy, but you know, I bet if you were successful, you involved your customers closely. You showed them things frequently. You know, you did short releases and iterations, and it may not have had the structure that you see in today's Scrum or XP or Kanban, which is all great, by the way. I'm a huge fan. But you know, well-run technology projects back in the 80s and 90s were similar to Agile projects in many ways, even if you did use, you know, traditional techniques to run it. Those were the successful projects. So it's really just the evolution rather than a revolution.
Yeah, I guess, you're probably right. I probably did. I definitely was a big fan, even way back, of constantly letting the customer know what was going on, giving them insight into the team's inner workings. But, before all this agile stuff became popular, I remember having a few managers that were like, Dan, what are you doing?
Right, right.
Like, the customer's on the other side of the wall, bro.
Yeah, you're right. And you hear a lot of people talking about Agile saying, yeah, and the reason Agile's better is because, you know, we involve our customers and we do short iterations. And those things are true. However, lots of that was going on back before Agile was popular by, you know, more enlightened project managers.
Yeah, but they had to do it like in a clandestine way.
That's right. Like, why are you bothering the customer?
Yeah, or why are you telling them that
Customer.
yeah, or why are you telling them that the team had an argument over a product?
Right, exactly. Yeah.
We want them to think everything is like Shangri-La when they go away.
Yeah, so I think the folks that have popularized Agile have done a good thing in that they've taken some best practices, people that were running projects, and they've kind of said, you know, what would a normal human do to be successful in a given scenario, and let's codify that. And that's, you know, if you look at the Agile Manifesto, there's lots of words like trust and collaboration and transparency. And I always tell young consultants, you know, they say, how do you be successful with Agile? And I say, well, first of all, you have to have these values that are not foreign to you. These are values that you have with your family and values you have with your neighbors. I remember a young consultant once asking me, you know, how do I be successful in consulting? And I say, it's really easy. Your customer is like your neighbor, right? You want to treat them kindly. You want to treat them with respect. You want to have their best interest in mind, but they're not your friend. And so you keep a little bit of distance between you so you can be objective and help them. And the Agile Manifesto does a lot of that, and it's codified a lot of that stuff in a way that makes a lot of sense. So I think that it's been great for the industry.
That's awesome the way you say that. I immediately comes to mind when I took my exam. I think in retrospect, the one thing that helped me pass the exam, and I do run agile projects, and the one thing that helps me is, and tell me if this is crazy, I have one saying that sticks in my mind, and it's favor the empowered team.
Yeah, I think that's right on. I mean,
Like servant leadership, right? Like,
yeah,
you know that the room is too hot for the team to work in, call facilities, get a better temperature for them.
yeah.
You know that the stakeholders are coming in and interrupting them in the middle of the work. Stop the stakeholders from doing
Right.
it, right?
It's an interesting paradigm because, as it turns out, self-empowerment and self-organization require very strong leadership. It sounds ironic, it's strong, but it's different than what we traditionally think of as
It's not command and control.
right. Exactly.
All right. We understand these days that these folks have real expertise. They know what they need better than you do. So don't try to dictate everything to them. Let them drive it.
Yeah, that's kind of why we started Agile CXOs, because we looked at the industry after doing literally thousands of assessments of companies, and we said, you know, leadership's not really getting it. They want to be command and control. They want to micromanage when the teams are out there trying to be self-organized and self-empowered. And you can't micromanage self-empowerment. You can't go into a team and say, you shall be self-empowered now.
Yeah.
And here's how you have to do that. A leader's job in a successful, healthy, agile organization is to create an infrastructure and an environment. Can flourish and be self-empowered and really live it yourself.
And let the team elaborate on how they're going to do their empowerment.
Right. And so you have to provide that infrastructure. Right. And so you have to provide that infrastructure, and you got to provide guide rails, because after all, we are running a business and we're trying to make money. They're not all Picasso, right? You can't just let them roam free and be the artists they all want to be all the time, because you're trying to make money. So there has to be guide rails, and there has to be an infrastructure in place for them to be successful. And that's what we've done at Agile CXO, is created those guide rails and said, okay, here's a picture of what a successful Agile infrastructure looks like for leaders to emulate. And so they can open this book, it's called the Agile Performance Hierarchy, and they can say, these are the things that I'm expected to provide for my team if I'm going to be successful at large scale agility. So it's a universal problem.
Give me one example.
For instance, Agile leaders need to provide physical space that's aligned with Agile values. So you have Agile values such as collaboration and transparency. You can't collaborate if every person's in a different office in a different building. Very different. One of the basic premises of agility is that you have constant communications with your team members and your customers. You can't do that when everybody's in a cube in a different part of cube land. And there are people trying to solve it with video and trying to solve it with various tools. But by far, the most successful Agile teams are co-located. So providing that kind of environment, and not just location, but tools and culture and all those kind of things, are critical to an Agile leader for them to be successful. And most of them don't really understand that.
Right. And I'm glad that you brought up co-location. Co-location, of course, is the idea that everybody's under one roof, right?
Right. And it's kind of interesting. Just last month in Harvard Business Review, there was an article that was an argument against co-location, and they had done interviews with a lot of people. And it's interesting because HBR has done a number of stories over the years arguing against self-organization, self-empowerment, and autonomy for workers. And they did this a couple of years ago against holacracy, which is kind of a global self-organization model for business. And I always say, look, it makes sense. People that graduate from Harvard Business School are not likely to be fans of self-organization and self-empowerment.
Yeah, they want you to listen to them.
They're likely to be fans of traditional, that's just the way it works in academia. There's nothing wrong with that model if that's a model that you would like to choose in your business, but it's antithetical in a lot of ways to what we're trying to do in the Agile environment. So it's not something I pay a lot of attention to.
All right, let me challenge you with something here.
Sure.
I've been managing projects, Agile projects, for the last 6 years. And I have a tremendous challenge that I'm facing. I still can't figure out. And I put a lot of brain power into trying to figure this out. I've utilized a lot of the common things people talk about. Maybe you have a different aspect on it, all right? I am delivering, let's say, software projects, right? I have a different aspect on it, all right? I am delivering, let's say, software projects, right?
Right.
Now, we know that Agile promotes co-location as a majorly important principle. Everybody's under one roof, the war room, everybody's face-to-face, conversation, the daily stand-up, the retrospectives. It's great. Meanwhile, the model that many of these companies I've worked for is 90% of our labor is offshore.
Right.
How do we overcome? I've faced huge challenges in my career of trying to run an Agile project on a geographically distributed model with 90% of my resources offshore. I know about Skype, I know about instant message, I know about chat, I know about knowledge shares and things like, SharePoint. But, aside from using technology cleverly, an electronic Kanban board or whatever, how do we overcome the fact that Agile calls for co-location but, the business realities of our world is most of our labor is coming from overseas?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there's a couple of things that we've seen here that make sense. And you might not be able to do any of these, but for the folks that I work with that have this trouble, I try to encourage them to create standalone Agile teams in the countries where they're offshoring. So let's say they're offshoring to China or Russia or India. Those are all popular offshore spots. And they have teams of people over there, and they have teams of people here in the United States. One thing that usually doesn't work is when a single team tries to operate in an Agile way across those kind of boundaries. I'm not saying you can't make it work, but it's hard. One solution is to split the teams and have a standalone Agile team in India, let's say, where they have their own Scrum Master and their own ceremonies and their own stand-ups. And then you have a similar team in North America that's doing the same thing independently. And that way you're empowering the teams in India or China to be self-organizing and to be Agile on their own as independent entities.
That's cool.
And then you use a scrum of scrums technique, which is kind of like I always think of it as, if you're looking at a map of the universe and how the planets spin, and then moons spin around the planets, and then they spin around the sun. You're kind of looking at a scrum of scrum environments where they're doing iterations, you're doing iterations, and then as a group, you're doing a big iteration, and you have a daily or maybe a couple of times a week scrum of scrums stand up, and a scrum of scrums product demo, and a scrum of scrums retrospective.
All right, so basically what you're saying is you have the independent powered team in India, you have another one in the States or wherever, and so they have all those ceremonies, they feel like they're doing everything, they're getting their work done, and then with relatively few scrum masters, you can have a higher level meeting that rolls up into this, what you're calling
that's a perfect way to describe it, and it does work really well. Now, there's implications to things like backlogs, for instance. So one client I work with that does this, they have a master backlog, and then each team has its own backlog that is derived from the master backlog, and then they've got work being brought to the teams from those subservient backlogs. So it does add some level of complexity to backlog management and to product ownership, but it definitely works if you can pull it off.
All right, so I'm going to memorize everything that you said. And I'm going to bring it in.
Fortunately, you're recording, so you can always go back.
I am going to bring it in to my next client, and I'm going to present it as my own original thoughts. Is that okay with you?
Just you're being like a consultant. I like the way you're thinking.
All right.
All of this is in the book, the Agile Performance Hierarchy book, by the way. So you can.
How do I get that book?
You can get.
How do I get that book?
You can get a sample version of it on agilecxo.org, and then it'll be released on Springer on, they're telling me, October 8th, 2018.
Oh, that's cool. What is Springer?
So Springer's a New York publisher that specializes in technology books.
Oh, cool.
They do a lot of textbooks, and they have picked up the what we call the Agile Performance Hierarchy. The book is actually going to be titled Great Big Agile, an Operating System for Agile Leaders.
You like using that word, big agile. What's big? Big company, big ideas, big what?
Well, big agile is about making agile work at scale in a good medium to large size company.
Okay. All right. Yeah, so of course a small company is going to be able to do it.
There's lots has been written about small agile, about 4 and 8 person teams. There's a plethora of books.
Two pizza teams.
Yeah, right. There's a plethora of books about it, and we don't think that space is something for CEO of a company. Our experience is at a level where we want to run organizations, not individual teams, and so our models are really directed at that type of environment rather than the 2 pizza teams.
That's awesome. All right, just for my listeners, the 2 pizza rule is in Agile is your sprint teams, your development teams should be able to be fed with 2 pizzas. If you need more than 2 pizzas, you have too many people on your team.
Right. So we're talking about the 40 pizza organization, and how do you make that work?
Right. But even then, you have those teams broken down into decomposed units.
That's right. Right. Absolutely. And so our models are meta models. So we look at what does it take to run. One of our clients has 255 Scrum teams.
Whoa.
And how do you make, you don't make that work organically. I mean, you can do some things, but a lot of folks in the Agile community are fond of saying, learning is done through basically each person teaching each other, and lots of things are done organically, and that's all good. And we believe in those things. But when you're running a 1,500 person technology organization, yeah, you need a little bit more than that to be successful. And that's what our models are about.
Okay. All right. Well, this has been totally awesome. At first I thought we would get into conversation like flow about Agile after I asked you a bunch of questions. I'm glad we did it first. But Good. Now, Jeff, so many of my listeners, they're going to love this. They're going to listen to this. But if they don't know Agile, there are a number of basic questions that I would like to hear answered by an expert. They're probably going to be all softballs for you in your high intellectual nature of Agile. All right. But I am going to lob them at you. We're going to do a little segment here where I'm going to ask you like the 10 to 15 most common questions that I'm asked about Agile. Feel free to answer them in a few words or a sentence or two or whatever length. You don't like the 10 to 15 most common questions that I'm asked about Agile. Feel free to answer them in a few words or a sentence or two or whatever length. You don't have to get professorial unless you feel like you want to. And I'm just going to ask you rapid fire. This is going to be like the Ask Jeff session about Agile.
Go for it.
All right, you ready?
Yep.
All right, number one, explain Agile to me in 30 seconds.
Agile is a philosophy and a way of thinking about how work gets done. It's not a particular process. It doesn't require any particular techniques. Agile is a philosophy of how work gets done that's based on the guidance set forth in the Agile principle. And these are things like trust your people, empower your teams, be transparent, lead by example. And there's just lots implied in there. But it's about a leadership model for how we behave at work and in our daily lives. And there's nothing that it isn't a method. It's just a philosophy of how work gets done.
Very good. Number two, what are the differences between Agile and traditional project management waterfall methodologies?
I'm going to say something controversial here. Agile is different because we plan to fail. And nobody likes to say that, but in reality, Agile was created because a vast majority of traditional projects were failure being defined as doesn't meet objectives. And some really smart people stepped back and said, if we're going to fail that often, let's plan to fail early, what they call fail fast and fail early when it's cheap. And that's why we see those iterations in Agile, is because we want to find out really early before we spend a lot of money if we're failing or not. So it's literally, we're saying, are we doing it right? Are we doing it right? Are we doing it right? And you just keep asking that over and over again. Where Waterfall is much more optimistic. We know we're going to lines in my Microsoft project work plan say we're going to succeed, and I'm going to work my butt off to make sure we succeed no matter what happens. And we're going to manage the hell out of all the changes. Where in Agile, we just accept changes all the time. So it's a very different kind of headspace.
Very good. Number three, what is a certified Scrum Master?
A certified Scrum Master is an individual who has taken a 2-day course offered by Scrum Alliance and has passed the exam. Now, there's a lot of controversy in the industry about the title Scrum Master, and even more controversy about the Certified Scrum Master, because it isn't difficult to become a certified Scrum Master.
There's no assessment.
There's an exam, but it's fairly simple. It's no PMP, let's put it that way.
Okay.
There's no such thing.
So they go to a course, they go to a 2-day course, they learn the framework, they take a basic exam, and poof, they're Scrum Masters.
They have a massive title that makes them sound quite important. Now, that's to necessarily make you a good one.
Right, but in this case, it sounds like having the PMP is more of an indicator that you're a good PM than being certified in Scrum makes you a good Scrum Master.
Well, I would say that the PMP is much more robust and detailed and really delves into the content, where the Scrum Master exam is not nearly that level of rigor.
Okay, and let's not forget that the PMP makes you prove years of experience before you can even sit.
Yeah, I just want to be careful with that, because as you know, there's people that have passed the PMP that aren't great.
That's true. That's true.
There's some that are great. So
it's a collective profile of experience and certifications. Yep.
Right. So I think the CSM is similar. There's another exam called the Professional Scrum Master that's more rigorous, that's offered by scrum.org. We're preferring that right now for our clients, only because it is more rigorous. But I understand the Scrum Alliance is doing some things too to make theirs more rigorous. So I think things too to make theirs more rigorous. So I think they're all moving in the right direction.
Okay. What are the basic roles in Scrum? You don't have to explain every one. Tell me just a couple of the most important roles in Scrum.
Right. Well, according to Scrum, there's only 3 roles. There's the Scrum team, the Scrum product owner, and the Scrum master. So those 3 roles are the only roles that exist in Scrum, at least according to the literature. And because Scrum teams all pick up whatever has to be done at any given time, there's no need to have a different role. Now, in practical reality, having assessed at least 200 Agile orgs in the last 10 years, I've never met a company that didn't have all kinds of different roles on their Scrum team, architects and DBAs and testers and all the things that you would see in a traditional. So there's a lot of conflict there between the vision, which is a great vision, and what actually happens on the ground, which is another reason why we started Agile CXO.
Okay. All right. What is the daily stand-up?
Sometimes people call it the Scrum, but the Daily Stand-Up is an event where every day the team gathers together, hopefully face-to-face, and they talk about what they've accomplished as a group. So that each person says, I've accomplished the following things since the last time we were together, so that everybody knows what everybody's working on. They talk about what they plan to accomplish before the next meeting, and then they talk about things that are impeding their progress. So that's kind of the basic format. And so it's an information session, so everybody knows what's going on. And it's also an opportunity for team members to share problems that they're having trouble solving. So maybe somebody, including the Scrum Master, can help them solve it. The format's traditionally in a 15-minute format every day. And we actually do this in our company. We have a 2:00 daily stand-up every single day. And we're not co-located. We're all over the world. And we get on video every day for 15 minutes. And at first, we were a little skeptical about how this was going to work for us. And we're not co-located. We're all over the world. And we get on video every day for 15 minutes. And at first, we were a little skeptical about how this was going to work for us because we were used to the weekly 2-hour, session. And it's been wonderful for the company. So I highly recommended that people do the daily stand-up.
Awesome. Very good. Very good. And they call it a stand-up because I guess they wanted people to stand up so that they wouldn't take too long?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So it's kind of funny because a lot of people sit down at the stand-up and we always say, hey, let's all stand up, because otherwise people go on. You know how meetings are like that, where everybody talks and people want to get their point in, and you got the meeting lasts 45 minutes before you're done. The reason they called it the stand-up is they wanted it to be a quick session where people didn't go on for a long time. And that's why they have that disciplined format. And standing up stops people from going on at length. So that's exactly why they did that.
People like to go on at length sometimes, right?
They sure do, yeah.
But now, like the high-level customers and stuff, they're not invited to that stand-up, right?
Not usually. I mean, the typical environment for the Agile ceremonies is the customers are not usually involved. You do see customer involvement in the sprint demo, of course, and you see product owner involvement at the sprint planning session. But the daily stand-up is usually just the project team, or what they call the Agile team. Now, there are very culturally advanced Agile practitioners that we work with that do invite some of their customers to the stand-up because their customers understand how Agile works and are willing to participate in it philosophically. But usually, when you bring a business customer into a stand-up, it kind of corrupts the meeting because they'll co-opt it with things they want to talk about, as customers often do since they're paying the bill. And that kind of corrupts the system. So we try not to involve them unless we're culturally pretty advanced.
Okay.
Well, you got to step back a tiny bit and look at the product backlog, which is the list of stuff that the team is tasked with doing over time. And it's normally organized in user story or epic format. Well, at the sprint planning meeting, the product owner who represents the business will gather with the Agile team, and he or she will present their priority for the sprint. So they'll say, in this sprint, we would like to produce the following bits of value or functionality. And during that meeting, the Agile team will estimate, typically using planning poker or some type of relative estimating technique, whether or not they can deliver the things that the product owner is asking for based on their historical performance, what they call velocity. And then they'll negotiate with the product owner for the stories that they can fit in. So if they estimated at, let's say, 26 points of size, and points are just sizing indicators, and the traditional points they're able to deliver, what they call velocity, is only 15. Points they're able to deliver, what they call velocity, is only 15. Then they say to the product owner, we can't fit in everything you asked, but here's the things we can do in this order. So that prioritization happens during that meeting, and the estimating happens, and then the team accepts or subscribes to the stories that they believe they can accomplish during the upcoming sprint.
Okay, and in that sprint, right, I guess the amount of velocity or the amount of work they can complete would depend on the length of the sprint. How long should sprints be?
Yeah, so velocity is only valid if the sprints are a consistent length or duration. So if you're switching between 2 weeks and 3 weeks and 4 weeks every other sprint, the velocity doesn't really have meaning, because velocity is a metric of delivery of value over a given time period. So the decision on how long you should make your sprints is really based on risk. So if you're a very experienced team, and you've been working together a lot, and you're really max window, but I have seen teams doing 4-week sprints, so it's not that uncommon. If you're a new team and you've never worked together, or you're working on a technology you've never worked before, 1-week sprints are fairly common. And it all goes back to that fail early, fail fast concept I was talking about earlier. If I don't know what I'm doing and I've never worked with my team before, the chances of failure are very high because we really haven't worked our kinks out yet. So why would I do a 4-week sprint when I can figure out in a week, do a retrospective, make corrections, try it again, do another retrospective, make corrections or enhancements or improvements or whatever you want to refer to them as. And then at some point say, okay, we are now on the road to being a great team together. Let's expand our sprint duration a little longer and experiment with 2-week sprints. So that's a very typical kind of approach to determining sprint duration.
Right. So in other words, the longer the sprints get, you start moving towards iterative or waterfall. That's not what we're talking about with Agile.
Right.
We're talking about bringing product to the customer rapidly.
Right.
We're talking about bringing product to the customer rapidly.
Yeah, I have one of the reasons that we started Agile CXO is I was working with the state government and they were doing 60-day sprints. And it was like they were failing so much throughout the 60 days, but not catching it and correcting it. So they were never actually improving. And so we went back and said, look, here's the philosophy, right? Here's the approach you should take to determining your sprint duration. And it really is based on how much risk do we want to have in failure? And if you don't know who you're working with, there's a high risk. So let's keep it short.
All right. So they were doing 60-day sprints and they weren't doing, which leads us to the next question. What is a retrospective?
Right. So in that example, when they did their retrospective after 60 days, they were cramming 60 days worth of mistakes and failure, basically, in their case, into an hour-long discussion of how we can make ourselves better. Far better to do and make ourselves better. Far better to do a retrospective at the end of every sprint when you have a week or 2 or 3 week sprints, because you're really examining basically 3 factors. What are the things we did really well that we want to keep on doing? So typically that's referred to as what went well. Some people say, what should we keep doing? This is a list of things that we know are best practices that work for us and our team, not necessarily for anyone else, but they work for us. The second question is what didn't go so well, or what could we do better, or what do we want to stop doing? Those are 3 different versions of that. And that's literally a list of stuff that's saying, stop doing these things immediately. And finally, then there's what are we going to do differently next time? So typically, how are we going to change our approach? Sometimes teams meet and they say, that was a great sprint. Everything went great. We got no changes. And that's great if they say that. And sometimes the teams are saying, you know what, this team's not working the way it's structured. We need to rethink how we're doing it structured. We need to rethink how we're doing it. Let's try something different next time. So you can see the shorter your sprints, the more you have the ability to change course when it's cheap, meaning not after a lot of time has been spent, and because time is money. So the retrospective is an essential thing. Now, we were talking about Scrum of Scrums earlier. This is a whole other idea, the enterprise retrospective. You don't really see this in Scrum so much, but the idea that the teams are sending representatives to an enterprise retrospective to say, here's how we work at the meta level together between departments, between customers, across projects, and so forth. That's a different level of retrospective.
So is that sort of like portfolio management and Waterfall?
Yeah, I mean, in a way, yeah, in that it's kind of like the bigger picture view of how we're going to get better as an organization. And so you could do it at a portfolio level. You see that a lot, where if a PMO is running, a massive program that has many sub-projects, you want to have a program that has many sub-projects. You want to have a way to look across the projects and see how we can improve it. And that Scrum of Scrums retrospectives is the way to do it.
That's cool. That's really cool. All right. Well, thank you so much for blowing those questions out of the water. All right. So, that was a great baseline on the most common questions that I'm asked about Agile, and I appreciate that. So let me ask you, I know that Agile is, tell me if I'm wrong. I'm okay with being wrong. But I know that Agile has been largely based around software development, at least initially, right? Just as PMP, was largely based around waterfall projects, like with the military and the building of, military weapons or, things like that. So, as we move forward now with industry, software, it's not all about software. So what happens now with these other industries? I don't know, manufacturing or these other industries can with Agile?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think if you step back and say, what is Agile? Agile is a philosophy of how we do work where we fail fast and fail early, and we're transparent and collaborative. So yes, absolutely. Now, can all companies use Scrum? Maybe not. Remember, Scrum and XP and Kanban are frameworks that were developed and have what I call values traceability up to the Agile Manifesto. So, Scrum can say, yes, our stand-ups trace to collaboration and transparency, and our sprint demos trace to these values. So Scrum is a practical implementation of Agile values. It may or may not work in an automotive manufacturing plant to have sprint demos and co-located teams as Scrum requires, or at least Scrum recommends. But that doesn't mean you can't have a framework or methodology that promotes collaboration, transparency, and so forth. So this is an important distinction that Scrum is something you do. Agile is something you are. They're very different concepts. And, Agile describes why we do things. It's what I call a why-ability model. We all talk about maturity or capability, but nobody really, bifurcates it down to the three: the why, the what, and the how. So Agile is all about why we do stuff. You could invent a whole new Agile framework like Scrum or XP to make it work in an auto manufacturing plant. If you wanted to, there's no reason why not. There's some of that going on in some industries. But one of the things you see that is frustrating for me is people conflate Scrum and Agile. And Scrum is 90% of the software development Agile market. It's huge. That's an anecdotal number. I don't have a detailed number, but everybody I work with is using Scrum, so you hardly ever see XP.
Right. It's sort of like saying everybody thinks a Xerox is a photocopy.
Right. I spent a lot of time in auto plants in my career. I struggle with seeing how that would work, but I think some aspects of it maybe. But that doesn't mean you couldn't be Agile, and that's a very different conversation.
All right. Awesome. I appreciate it. All right. Let's sum it up with this. Now, let's fast forward 10 years from now. Okay, what's the future of project management? Will Agile take over Waterfall? Will they remain as some sort of a hybrid concoction? Where do you see project management going in, say, the next 10 years?
Yeah, it's interesting. I give this talk about Agile where I have some data from Gartner about people worldwide throwing off the shackles of command and control. And you see it not just in software, but you see it in government and religion and education and all these financial industries and all these industries. People are hungry to have more self-autonomy and self-control. So I see more of that, which doesn't necessarily bode well for the current approach that the PMI, for instance, or the CMMI Institute is taking, where they tend to have a look and feel that's more command and control. So I see those things changing over the years. I see leadership transitioning from the current, what is largely command and control environment, to a more of a collaborative, self-organizing governance environment, which is a very different kind of way to run a company. So I see that transitioning. The really big adopters that control the market, like the government, for instance, the Department of Defense, and companies like GM, Ford, Chrysler, Lockheed, and some of the really big companies that are command and control in nature, they're going to kind of drive it, and they always have. So if we start seeing the GMs of the world, and I'm just using them as an example, the really big
somebody to set a trend.
Yeah, because they set the trend. I mean, Waterfall used to be cool back, when I was young, and they set a that involved lots of gates and lots of documentation. Set the trend. I mean, Waterfall used to be cool back, when I was young, and they set a trend that involved lots of gates and lots of documentation and lots of oversight and lots of command and control. And you can trace it back and see why it happened. It happened because the projects were struggling and not successful. So management threw in more gates and more documents and more risk logs and more and more and more. And it became this big, huge, kind of difficult to manage process that required PMPs to make it work. And if those companies go along with the worldwide trend of people being more hungry for self-organization, and they need to do it because they're already having trouble hiring people who want to work in a command and control environment. Young people, especially in technology, they're coming into the market and they're saying things like, no, I don't want to report to a manager every day. I don't want to have to do a status report. I want to, do cool stuff and write cool software. And, for old guys like you and me, we're looking at that saying, oh, who do these kids think they are? But in reality, they're really resetting the market, because it's a universal desire everywhere for people to have that self-organizing, self-empowerment.
Yeah. It's just that us older guys will say, oh yeah, no, we do it the old way because we still want to work. But the millennials are sort of like, no, dude, I'm doing it my way, or I'm not doing it at all.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that's true. And at first you kind of react to that. You're like, okay, kids, we need to, we need to have a talk.
Party time's over.
But in reality, they're changing the market. And
well, not only that, Jeff, but let me throw this at you. I think it might be possible, if things follow the way you're saying, that, with Agile and self-empowerment and collaboration, people who know psychology and sociology and people who are skilled in the arts and stuff, you might be seeing more project managers or scrum masters coming into the field who are experts in human thinking.
You're exactly right. And I always say, that, go to colleges and sort of what we used to say, back up the school bus and at a college and hire a bunch of kids. They're looking in the wrong place. I've been saying this for a while. Music school, literature, history are the places where the project leaders of the future are coming from. In my mind, there's no doubt about that.
All right. You brought up music.
Yeah.
Now, I heard that besides being a project management guru, you occasionally play music. Is that true?
That is true. My first degree was in music, and made my living playing in orchestras for about a decade before I even picked up my first computer. I do quite a bit of playing in the jazz space. So I tour and I play with groups and do records, and I kind of have that I don't have it as my main profession anymore, but I do spend a lot of time doing that.
That's awesome. I really appreciate that. Recently, I got my son a guitar just out of the blue for his birthday, and it turns out he's like a real natural at it.
Oh, good, man.
We brought him to a teacher, and the guy trained him for 1 hour. He said, your son's a natural. He learns the songs on the first try. He's got the ear. He memorizes everything.
Yeah, I do a talk at music schools on this. I call the talk Falling Forward, and it's a play on the term having something to fall back on. So, all kids that go to music school, their parents, especially their mothers, say, oh, you can major in music, but please minor in engineering because you need something to fall back on. It's wise advice, that I didn't take. Yeah. But here's the thing is music especially teaches you things about people. It teaches you how to organize people. It teaches you how to perform and do something perfect in front of a group. It teaches focus.
There's math in it.
It's analytical. It's architectural.
Yep.
And I say, you know what, guys? They're not teaching this crap in business school. So, all these big consulting firms are backing up to Harvard and U of M and big name schools and buying engineering and B school kids into it when they don't have the skills you need to succeed. And, the music students, they don't have the technical skills necessarily to write software, but guess what? It's just like learning an instrument. And so if they're proficient on the violin, they're going to be proficient at software development if they want to be. But they'll also have the bonus of bringing all these great people skills to the table that you just don't get in business school. And I always tell these kids in music school, if you don't want a career in music, or if you don't make it into that orchestra, if you don't get into that jazz band or whatever you're trying to do, it's not a disaster for your life because you can turn this into a great career if you want to. So it's amazing, and your son should keep doing it.
I love that. That's so inspirational. I really appreciate it. So all we got to do is have a psychology degree, a music degree, and a project management degree, and we're set.
That's all, man.
All right. Well, this has been awesome. Jeff Dalton, thank you so much for cited agilecxo.org. He's got the big book coming out on Big Agile, big. All right. Go check out his blog on Ask the CMMI Appraiser. And don't forget about the Big Agile Retrospective meeting that's going to be happening in DC on September 27th at 11 a.m. Again, you can check all these links out in my comments. Thank you so much for being with me today, Jeff.
Thank you, Dan. Appreciate you having me on.
All right, and everybody, thank you for listening, and please check out my website at www.thepmtutor.com.